Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, welcome to the 7th webinar in the Trust series that's been organized by the Working Capital and Black Sun. Today is the 7th webinar on Tone at the Top, and we've been running this webinar since the 2nd of April, and the final one will be on the 13th of August. The 8th webinar is on sustainability reporting, which will be covering things like climate change, sustainability frameworks, and how to put in the sustainability framework into place. So today's topic is on Tone at the Top. And if I can take you to the next slide, trust is really the cornerstone of the 8 webinars that we've been running for the last couple of months, since April, well, more than that. And we believe that trust is a centerpiece that connects all the 8 webinars that we've been running together over the last months since April the 2nd. And this is how it looks like. We started with corporate culture on the 2nd of April. Then we move on to stakeholder engagement. And we learned in that webinar that there are 5 stakeholder groups: your customers, your employees, your suppliers, your community, and finally your shareholders. We looked at how business models are structured. We look at risk management. Of course, it's quite clear how risk management is linked to trust. The better you are in being able to manage risk, the more trusted you are as an organization. We looked at long-term value creation. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at purpose, the why behind what you do. And the key thing is that although we started with corporate culture, we believe that everything starts with purpose. It all starts with purpose, or what we call what is a why. Why do you do the things that you do? Why is the thing that drives how you do things, or what you do things, or where you want to go? So why is the starting point for everything that we are talking about in these 8 series webinars, including today. You soon realize that as I conclude these webinars today, for today's session, I will conclude by saying that why is a tone rather than anything else that starts with the tone at the top. And finally, on 13 August, we'll be covering sustainability. Now, they all may link to be linked to trust, but at the same time, each of these components are linked to each other. Like for example, risk management is linked to sustainability. Tone at the top is linked to the business model. Stakeholder engagement is linked to purpose. Long-term value creation is linked to corporate culture. So they're intertwined. And as I mentioned earlier, for those of you who have missed the first 6 sessions of this series of 8 webinars, they're all available on YouTube. Look out for the Black Sun YouTube channel. And if you Google that, they're all available in this full recording. And if you do want to get hold of the slides, they're also available on the Black Sun website. Let me clear this. So as we go to this webinar today, please bear in mind that as we talk about tone at the top, it's not a standalone topic, but it's first of all linked to trust. That to have the right tone at the top, the end game is trust, but at the same time, the outcome is really to have a good corporate culture, to have proper stakeholder engagement, to have the right business model, to have proper risk management, to create long-term value, and to make sure that you have a purpose behind everything that you do. So tone at the top by itself cannot stand. Tone at the top is intertwined once again with all the rest of the 8 topics that we have talked about, or will talk about here on this diagram here. So what is tone at the top? I think that's in terms of the challenges for today's webinar, the most difficult part, as far as I can see, is really trying to define what is tone at the top, to wrap your head around what is tone at the top. So some people say tone at the top is the directions from the board. Then you have cases like Wells Fargo, where they introduce a new concept called tone in the middle, which is culture. And then you have things like organizations will talk about the code of ethics, which is called linked to tone at the top. So what indeed is the tone at the top? And I thought that it's good to start with a definition of tone at the top by looking at the case study. And the first case study I wanted to share with you is this case study from the Harvard Business Review called The Parable of the Sadhu. It's a pretty old case study, 1983, so quite a number of years ago. But as I go through the case study, each time I want to talk about tone at the top, I will share with the audience about the parable of the sadhu, and it's still very relevant, even though it's an old case study. And some of you may know that I do climb mountains as a hobby. I'm a sort of amateur mountaineer, and no case is better than the parable of the sadhu to start the conversation as to what is the tone at the top. So as you want to get to the top of the mountain, the issue of the tone at the top comes to mind. So getting to the top, tone at the top, it helps people to remember what the issues are as we go through the case study. So as a background to this case study, there are a bunch of mountaineers, a group of them making up of 4 nationalities: Americans, New Zealanders, Swiss, and Japanese. So there were about a dozen of them in total, covering 4 nationalities, and they were climbing a mountain in the Himalayas. And what the moral of the story behind this case study is really explores moral dilemmas, meaning that do you have to do one wrong not to commit another wrong? And it explores how tone at the top is an important issue as you face challenges in life, in your organization, and in particular in this case study. So that's really the story behind this story, to give life to this issue about moral dilemmas. So as a setting to this story, as part of during the most difficult part of the climb up the mountain, the adventurers, which once again comprises the 4 nationalities, they encountered a near-dead, almost naked, barefoot Indian holy man called a sadhu. So sadhu is a holy man. He was found in the snow, and once again, this is a real story. And he was suffering from hypothermia, exhaustion. And so the explorers found him naked, almost naked, in the snow. And at that point in time, they were faced with a decision: help the sadhu or keep on climbing. So the climbers helped the sadhu one way or the other, starting with the climbers from New Zealand. So the New Zealanders helped to carry the sadhu part of the way down the mountain, but not totally all the way down to somewhere safe. They carried the sadhu down part of the way. Now, secondly, the Swiss and Americans gave the sadhu some food and gave him some clothing to keep him warm. And thirdly, the Japanese also gave him some food, but none of them brought him all the way down to the village where he could be totally taken care of and be safe. So everybody did something, but at that point in time, there was a moral dilemma: help the sadhu to be safe all the way down to the village, or keep on climbing and leave the sadhu where he is. And that was really the crux of the story of the parable of the sadhu, where you're forced with facing a moral dilemma choice. Do you do the right thing by taking care of the sadhu and then jeopardize you not be able to reach the summit? Or do you do the wrong thing and keep on climbing and leave the sadhu to where he is at the point in time? And that's really is a tone at the top. The challenge with that, the tone at the top engenders moral dilemmas, which I'll be covering in a little while. But the real issue about the definition of tone at the top, I believe, is all about moral dilemmas. And that the tone at the top induces a situation of moral dilemmas. And you soon see, not just in cases of moral dilemmas, but I'll bring up a case study of the Wells Fargo case study, where the tone at the top results in a moral dilemma situation. So the quick lesson to learn from today's webinar is that it is not about positioning the tone at the top that most organizations do, where they look at the tone at the top, make sure that it's transmitted to the rest of the organization. But really, the challenge with the tone at the top is really how do you manage moral dilemmas that people in organizations face when they are hit with situations that they cannot control. So in this situation, the climbers are faced with a situation they can't control. So they can't control meeting a sadhu. So the sadhu is an icon that I hope that you remember in your mind, that as we do our work, as we work in organizations, we will all meet our equivalent of the sadhu. So these climbers meet the sadhu, and they're given a situation where they're facing a choice, that they have to make a difficult choice. So most of us will meet our sadhus at work, and we have to make difficult choices. So these difficult choices are what we call moral dilemmas. So here on this slide here, they meet the sadhu. And at that point in time, you must realize that they met the sadhu at the most dangerous part of their climb. For these climbers from New Zealand, from Switzerland, from Japan, and from US. And when you're at the most dangerous part of your climb, mountaineers have only one thing in their mind: try to reach the top safely, because mountains are not fair or unfair, they're just extremely dangerous. So at this point in time, the mountaineers in the mind get to the top by all means necessary, and then they meet the sadhu. So when you're at that point in time, you're faced with a very difficult choice. If you stop and help the sadhu, you're almost likely never to reach the top, because once you stop, you lose the momentum, things get more dangerous, the weather changes, situation changes, you can't keep climbing, you lose the opportunity to climb right to the top. And that's what happens if, what can possibly happen if you stop to help the sadhu. But if they keep on climbing and don't help the sadhu might die, possibly die, because he's in a situation where he's dying from hypothermia, he's half naked, and he's exhausted. So as all of us face challenging situations in our work life, you have a tone at the top, meaning that we have to go to the top because of KPIs, targets, performance measures, expectations from the bosses. So we all have our summits to reach, and we are at the most dangerous part of the climbing to the top, or equivalent of climbing to the top. When we are about to finish a project, we are asked to do something that could potentially jeopardize our attempt to reach the top. What do you do? And that's really the crux of today's webinar. What do you do when you're faced with a moral dilemma? And the moral dilemma is introduced by the tone at the top. So no matter what happens, you have to make that choice. And it is that choice making that's really the most important thing about the tone at the top. How do you help the people in the organization make that difficult choice between right and wrong, between two wrongs, between two rights? And that kind of moral dilemma is very difficult. And organizations, the board, the management's duty is really to help people make the right choice and be confident that it is the right choice. So here you have it, the moral dilemma that is faced by the climbers. So the climbers are at the most dangerous place. They stop, they will never get to the top. If they stop to help the sadhu, there's a likelihood that they will not reach the summit because the situation gets dangerous. On the other hand, if they keep on climbing and reach the top, the sadhu, what will happen to him? Will he or will he not survive? So tough choice. If you are doing your job and you're faced with a tough choice, what will you do? And this is where I want you to think of a solution right now. So what is that solution? What is that thing that should be inside an organization to help people meet these challenges? And the thing is that there is no choice with regards to tone at the top. You'll soon see in a little while that the codes of corporate governance around the world, and I'll be covering the UK, Singapore, and Malaysia. All countries have a code of corporate governance that encourages a form of tone at the top. So the tone at the top is something that's going to happen. But when the tone comes down to the organization, that's where rubber hits the road. How do you deal with situations that is caused by the tone at the top? And that's where people sort of forget that you have this great tone, but tone at the top have what we call unintended consequences. In the Wells Fargo case study, there's one is a good example of unintended consequences. And that's, in my view, what companies face all the time. The tone at the top have unintended consequences. So same thing when you climb a mountain, in this case of the parable of sadhu, there are unintended consequences when you climb the mountain. You may encounter situations that you can never predict, but when you encounter it, like meeting the sadhu, what would you do when you meet the sadhu? So a quick summary at this point in time, all of us will meet our equivalent of the sadhu as we go through our work, our lives, personal lives, work lives. And when we meet our sadhu, we are faced with a difficult choice because there's a tone from the top. And the tone forces us into a moral dilemma. Do we or do we not, with regards to the choice you have to make? And when they met the sadhu, this was the moral dilemma faced by the climbers. So the Americans, the Kiwis, the Japanese, and the Swiss, no one was willing to take the final responsibility for the sadhu. So what's the ultimate responsibility or the final responsibility? To make sure that the sadhu is alive. And no one, but everybody was willing to do his bit. So the Americans and the Swiss gave the sadhu some warm clothes. The Japanese gave the sadhu food. The Kiwis carried the sadhu a little bit down the slope. But when it comes to taking the final responsibility to make sure that the sadhu was completely safe, no one was willing to do that. So when it was going to be a border, everybody just passed the buck and took off to climb to the top. And that was what happened in the case study of the parable, the sadhu. And the moral, if you read the case study, I do encourage you to read the case study. What should an organization do to put into place when the people are faced with this situation where they're faced with a moral dilemma? How do you stop a situation where people are not willing to take the ultimate responsibility for the sadhus that they face? Is that instructions? Is that in the code of ethics? Is that in the code of behavior? What behavior do you want to encourage within organizations when they're faced with a moral dilemma caused by the tone at the top? So the tone at the top causes unintended consequences, which is a sadhu. When we meet the sadhu, we are faced with a situation to make that decision. But as you can see in this case study, the climbers made the decision to leave the sadhu behind. They all felt that they did what they could do, but nobody wanted to take the ultimate responsibility. And in this case study, the challenging question from the author of this case study, which was one of the climbers, was how do you make people take the final responsibility or take that ultimate responsibility to do what is right, to not to go to the top, but to do the right thing. And that's really the difficult thing for us to inculcate. And I'll let you know, I'll hint to you that the answer lies somewhere in the code of ethics and culture. So as you can see, the tone at the top is linked to culture, it's linked to code of ethics, it's linked to purpose, it's linked to risk management. So they are all intertwined. So you can't look at tone at the top and say, tone at the top and manage it by itself. There are other moving parts that affect the tone at the top, like culture. So like in the Wells Fargo case study, the tone at the top is affected by the tone in the middle. And in that article by Forbes, the tone in the middle is corporate culture. So you may have your best and most well-designed tone at the top, but it can be overturned by the tone in the middle. And as you read the case study, you probably can conclude in some ways what happened to the sadhu. Did the sadhu survive, or did the sadhu perish in the cold? Because you can conclude from what you've read so far in these slides that the climbers left the sadhu by himself in the snow. They gave him food, they gave him warm clothing, they helped him carry a little bit down the slope of the mountain. But at that height, which is about 5,000 meters, 5,000 meters is pretty high. At 5,000 meters, it's dangerous. If the climbers don't go on, they will never reach the summit. So they decided to do what they can. So the thing to note is that the climbers did what they can as individuals, but not as a group. So nobody took the ultimate responsibility to make sure that the sadhu was safe and would not perish in the snow slopes. So nobody took the lead for group responsibility. They all took individual responsibility. They did what was sufficient, and then from there they went on to climb the summit. So what does it take to have that group responsibility, or what we call shared values? Shared values are, of course, is linked to culture. When values are shared, it leads to a corporate culture. So as you can soon realize that tone at the top is linked to shared values. If there's no shared values, there's no culture. There's no culture, the tone in the middle doesn't work. The tone in the middle doesn't work, the tone at the top does not have any effect at all. So you can have a nice tone at the top, but it does not cascade down to everybody within the organization. It's just empty noises, or what we call an empty ship makes the loudest noise. So we've just covered the first case study, and the second case study is the Wells Fargo case study. And now I'll be covering the regulations on the tone at the top. So maybe just a quick recap. The tone at the top, we started with trying to define what the tone at the top is by looking at the parable of the sadhu. And really, it's defined by moral dilemmas. The tone at the top is defined by what happens when you're faced with a difficult situation. Then you realize that what is the tone at the top, because you have to meet the expectations of the tone at the top. So for mountain climbing, the tone at the top is literally getting to the top. For organizations that you work in, the tone at the top is expectations, is KPIs, is targets, is things that you're expected to do. So in order to meet those expectations, which are the tone at the top, sooner or later you will meet your sadhu. And your sadhu is that crossroad where you have to meet your sadhu, and you have to make a moral dilemma decision. Do this thing or do that thing. So either way, you will have consequences or unintended consequences. How do we manage all these unintended consequences as a result of meeting your sadhu? So to me, that is really the real definition of the tone at the top. How do you manage the unintended consequences? So if I were to define the tone at the top, it's really tone at the top is the management of unintended consequences in the organization. Because it's easy to talk about, it's easy to define or to write down what the tone is. And you can see from these regulations that we see around the world in the UK. And interesting that in the UK Code of Corporate Governance, it does not mention the words tone at the top at all. But as you can read the words in this paragraph that I cited from the UK Code of Corporate Governance, it says that the board should establish the company's purpose, values, strategy, and make sure they are aligned, act with integrity, lead by example, and to promote the desired culture. So all these components are the tone at the top. It's a message that the board will wish to transmit down to the rest of the organization. The Singapore Code of Corporate Governance, if you see on the right-hand side, is a bit more explicit. It says that the board must put into place a code of conduct and ethics and set the appropriate tone at the top and design organizational culture, proper accountability within the company. From what I can read in the UK and the Singapore Code, and soon the next page I'll be covering the Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance, nobody defines what is the tone at the top. We can talk about the tone at the top, but we hardly see the definition of tone at the top in regulations, or even you Google what's tone at the top. There's no direct interpretation or definition. If you Google it on Wikipedia, the tone at the top, they define it as something that came out as a result of the Enron fraud that occurred in the year 2000. So to me, like I say, I would define the tone at the top is unintended consequences that results from you meeting with your sadhu, or situations that causes moral dilemmas. So what is tone at the top? And I think the hint I've said it comes from culture, values, purpose. And we look at the Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance, it has similar concepts. And the Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance talks about that the board plays a critical role in setting the appropriate tone at the top. So what is an appropriate tone at the top? You won't know it's appropriate or not until something goes wrong. When things go wrong, then you say it's inappropriate. But before things go wrong, what are the measures that organizations should put into place to be a safety net before the tone at the top goes berserk? So tone at the top must provide thought leadership, championing good governance and ethical practices throughout the organization. So we've seen a new word here, ethical practices. We talk about moral dilemmas, we talk about values. So, and the Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance takes it one step further to talk about setting the tone with regards to implementation through the Code of Conduct and Ethics. So at this juncture, we have quite a few keywords that we need to wrap our heads around. Beyond the parable of the sadhu, where we say that the tone at the top is about encountering your sadhu and encountering unintended consequences. But how do you then put into some of these moving parts together? Ethics, moral dilemmas, culture, purpose, values. these are the things that make up the tone at the top. And it's important to look at all these issues as we manage the unintended consequences that will come as a result of the tone at the top. So let me go on to the third part of this presentation. So we look at the case study, the parable of the sadhu, where we hope to have framed your mind with regards to what's the definition of the tone at the top. And I will encourage you within your own organization, if you want to talk about what is tone at the top, to use the parable of the sadhu to demonstrate in very layman terms, very safe terms as to what do you mean by tone at the top. Because people understand mountaineering in the way that they meet danger. When you're in a dangerous situation, how do you deal with it? When you are faced with a situation that you never intended. So use the parable of the sadhu as a starting point. Then secondly, look at some of these regulations around the world to understand that it is not strongly defined as to what is a tone at the top. Because the way that it's described, it's around terms of ethics, morals, values, code of conduct, purpose, culture. So there are a lot of words that's accompanied by the way that the tone at the top is described. And that's where a lot of people get confused. So what really is the tone at the top? And once again, to me, managing the tone at the top is all about managing the unintended consequences. But before that, let's go to the third part of this presentation, where we look at what are the difference between ethics, morals, and dilemmas, because these three words will come up again and again and again all the time. As I read through issues about tone at the top, these three words come out very frequently. So in order to manage tone at the top, or how to put in the right tone at the top within your organization, you must be comfortable with these three subject matter: ethics, morals, and dilemmas. And what's the difference between three of them? These three topics by itself can be a 1-year training course, because if you take a course on philosophy, this is what it's all about. But I'll try to cover it in a few slides to give you the basics as to what are ethics, morals, and dilemmas. Ethics are what we call rules, and they are normally external. They are enforced by an organization or profession or group. So an organization like a company will have a code of ethics or code of conduct. This is how you should behave. A group of lawyers, a group of accountants, a group of doctors, or even a church or a temple or a mosque who have certain rules with regards to how you should behave. So rules, ethics are rules which are external to the person. It's not internal to the person, but it's outside of the person. So these are what we call man-made guidance as to how you should behave. Like for example, you shall wear a blue dress to work. You should wear a black tie to work. These are rules, behavior that is expected of a person when he or she works or practice in that group or organization. So code of ethics is external. Morals, in comparison, are internal. This is what each of us, according to our own beliefs, our own ideals, how we decide what is something, whether something is right or wrong. So for example, I believe that gossiping is bad, but you may not think that it's bad. I believe that telling the truth is good, but you may not believe that it's good. So having the courage, keeping my promises, do not cheat, being trustworthy, do not judge. These are typically morally right things to do. Most people would think that these are the morally right things to do. So internally, most of us believe that internally, these are the right things to do. But of course, there are certain things like people say it's okay to tell a white lie. So I may think that it's right to tell a white lie, but you may not think that it's right to tell a white lie because your own values or your own ideals does not permit you to allow a white lie to be told. So we have different moral values or moral ideals. So morals are internal, ideals are external. So both morals and value and ethics are relate to right or wrong, but one is external, one is internal. And this is where the tone at the top causes that moral or ethical dilemma. Now, when we use ethical or moral dilemmas, we can use it interchangeably. So you can say ethical dilemma, moral dilemma. It generally means the same thing, but of course the scholars will tell otherwise. But for the purpose of this webinar on practice, for all intents and purposes, ethical dilemma as a moral dilemma is the same. So the challenge is that we say that in the parable of the Sadhu case study, tone at the top causes unintended consequences which lead to an ethical or moral dilemma. You're faced with a situation where you have to make a very difficult choice. You make one choice, you're wrong. You make the other choice, you also are wrong. But either way, you have to make a choice. You have to make that decision. So how do you help people make that decision and get them out of that dilemma? That's all about managing tone at the top. And that's the crux of it. So let me give you an example of a moral dilemma. So in the parable of the sadhu, we have learned about one moral dilemma where you have to decide whether you keep on climbing, let the sadhu potentially die, or help the sadhu and unlikely that you reach the top. So either way, something will not be achieved. Climb, sadhu die. Don't climb, don't reach the top. So either way, something goes wrong. So what do? If you're a professional climber and your life savings, your next paycheck depends on you reaching the top, if you don't reach the top, you will starve and you can't feed your children. And same thing in this case study that I see here, in any ethical system, if stealing is always wrong, so most of the time it's wrong, stealing is wrong. Letting a child starve is also wrong ethically, and I believe that morally is also wrong. So whether it's an ethical system or a moral system, whether it's internal, external system, stealing is always wrong. Letting a child starve is always wrong. But can you steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving child? Can you steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving child? So the tone at the top is that you must do the right thing. But when you're faced with this unintended consequence of the situation where you face a starving child, but there's no money in your pocket, so you have to steal potentially to feed the child. But if you don't steal, the child will starve to death. What do you do? And that happens at work. If you don't cheat, or you don't cheat to complement your salary, your child may die of starvation. But if you steal and you feed your child, you go to jail. So what do you do? So you have this situation called a moral ethical dilemma. And in this situation, you're forced to commit one wrong in order to avoid committing another wrong. So what do you do? And that's really the lesson to be learned from managing tone at the top. It's not about having beautiful statements where the board says that this is the tone, you should do the right thing. It's a nice speech about tone at the top, the right tone. But it is when things go wrong, when you realize that the tone at the top can have unintended consequences, or they are inappropriately set. They set the wrong targets, they set the wrong KPIs, the wrong performance measures, set the wrong expectations. Like for example, when the tone at the top says, we shall be innovative, we should always take care of our customers, we shall always win. These are values, and values come from the tone at the top. But what if you cannot meet these values? What if you have to do the wrong thing to meet these values? What if those values conflict with your own internal values? So those conflicts are what we call, once again, dilemmas. Whether it's a moral dilemma or ethical dilemma. Either way, it is a tough situation to face. The other good example that I will encourage you to share with your people at the workplace or within your organization is about this in terms of how to define moral dilemmas. Is this thing called the trolley problem. Now, the trolley problem is a very famous philosophical case study. It's not a real case study. I mean, it's not real in the sense that it didn't happen, but it is a made-up case study. It's a situation where you have this guy standing with a switch, and as he stands by the switch, he sees a trolley or a train approaching, barreling down the track towards 5 people who are tied up on the track. So if he doesn't do anything, he does nothing, the trolley will go straight and kill the 5 people on the main track. But if he pulls a switch or pulls a lever, the trolley will be diverted to another track and kill 1 person. So we have this ethical and moral dilemma that will be facing this person at the switch or at the lever. Do nothing, 5 will be killed. Do something, 1 will be killed. What do you do? There's a link at the bottom of this page. When you get your website, when you get your slides, you can watch this video. It's quite a funny slide in the sense that it's done in a very cartoonish manner, but it's a good case study to showcase what the tone at the top. So the tone at the top in this case study of the trolley problem say, save as many as you can. The tone at the top says, save as many as you can when you're faced with a problem. But what do you do? In this case study, with that instruction, which is an ethical code, which is external, which is a tone at the top, will it conflict with your internal morals? Your internal morals could be to say, save all lives. But you're faced with a situation where you have to kill 1 or kill 5. So in a way, you have a double dilemma, because your own internal moral dilemma says to save all lives and not to kill anybody. But here you have to kill 1 or kill 5 even. What do you do? And there are a lot of variations to this trolley problem. And if you read through this, it really boggles the mind as to the scenarios that we are faced with regards to the tone at the top, when we are faced with unintended consequences. So pulling the lever is like being at the tone at the top, being at the top of the mountain, or near the top of the mountain where you're faced with a sadhu. So your hand at the lever, about to pull or don't pull, is when you're facing your sadhu, unintended consequences. And we face this all the time, because tone at the top sets the values which are external to us. It sets performance indicators, sets measures, sets KPIs, sets expectations. So it is not fair to the people in organization. And when things are not fair, it causes a dysfunctional shift. And it is this dysfunctional shift called tone in the middle, or culture. And when the culture rebels against the tone at the top, that's when things go wrong. And that rebellion, you can see in the next case study called the Wells Fargo case study. So we covered the tone at the top case study by parable of sadhu. We looked at the trolley problem. And now let's look at the Wells Fargo case study. This case study was quite a few years ago, but it's still extremely relevant. I've used it to talk about culture. I've looked at it to talk about purpose, but today I'll be using this case study to talk about tone at the top. And the tone at the top came through the chairman, CEO, and president of the Wells Fargo Bank at that point in time. And this was found in the annual report. And this is where people should take things in the annual report seriously, that the tone at the top put into the annual report gets to all stakeholders. And this is where it's linked to stakeholder engagement. The annual report goes out to all stakeholders, engages with them. And when people read this, they will have to believe what is written in there. So here, John Stump, the president, CEO, chairman of Wells Fargo, said that everything that we do is guided by our vision to satisfy all our customers' financial needs and help them succeed financially by our values, which are people, ethics, what's right for our customers, diversity, and leadership. So here, what's right? So here, the tone at the top is to do the right thing. It can't be clearer than that. Do the right thing. It's written here in the 2010 annual report from Wells Fargo. The CEO say, do the right thing. Do what's right for our customers. Do right by our values, by our ethics, by our code of ethics. So here is one message the tone sent down to the organization. But at the same time, the CEO's tone also, in addition doing what's right for a customer, he also said that every customer must have 8 accounts. And he calls it 8 is great. Why 8 is great? Because it rhymes. So this was a directive. This was the tone at the top. So the CEO's tone at the top was do the right thing for each of our customers by making sure that each of them has 8 bank accounts. Do it. This is the tone at the top. And this causes dilemmas for the staff within the bank. So a few thousand employees, bank employees, for these bank employees, it proved burdensome to them because they have to meet this target and this quota. And this quota was the tone from the top. And can you imagine, and these are real situations, some of these bank employees, they open up bank account for retirees in old folks' homes. They open up internet banking accounts when these old folks did not even have a laptop or internet access. So they created and they open up fictitious accounts for thousands of banks customers. So they began to cut corners. They open up bank accounts, credit card accounts for customers without the knowledge or permission. So imagine here you have a dilemma. Don't meet the tone at the top, you lose a job. You don't get your commission. You meet the tone at the top by meeting the expectations. You have to cut corners, you have to cheat, you have to lie. You have to open up bank accounts for the little old folks in the old folks' homes who don't have internet banking, also don't have internet access, but yet you open up an internet banking account for them. So they're caught in a moral dilemma. Cheat the customers, get your salary. Don't cheat the customers, don't get your salary. You cannot buy food for your family, you get evicted from your home. What do you do? So the tone at the top causes unintended consequences. I'm sure that the CEO here did not intend for his employees to cheat, but over 5,000 employees cheated. So can you imagine 5,000 people cheated by creating fictitious, not just 1 or 2 fictitious accounts, but 2 million fictitious accounts over a span of 5 to 6 years. So over a long time, 5,000 people created millions of bank accounts that were fictitious. How can that possibly happen? So the situation was caused by the tone at the top, which had the unintended consequences of making people faced with unintended consequences. So here if it, so 5,300 employees were involved in this scam to create fictitious accounts, 2 million of the accounts that resulted in 2.6 million in fees being obtained. Well, the fees are not big money, but the fact that they created 2 million fictitious accounts that will open up for banks customers over a period of 5 years. So it's not something that's done over a year or two. It's over 5 years, and not just a few hundred bank accounts, but millions of bank accounts, and not just a few hundred bank employees, but 5,300 employees. So that's really a lot of people, a lot of accounts, a lot of time involved. And what has caused this is really that cascading down from the tone at the top that allowed the tone in the middle to bloat up and to create a culture of contempt within the organization. So here you have another YouTube where Elizabeth Warren, I think she's the chairperson of the Senate Committee on Banking, and said that and gave a dressing down to the CEO of Wells Fargo and said that other banks average 3 accounts per customer, but you wanted 8. Your tone at the top was the 8. And why you say 8? Because 8 rhymes with great. And your rationale, and that was your rationale. So there's no rhyme or reason. Well, it rhymes with great. And they put and the CEO, John Stump, put it into the annual report. So an innocent, so-called innocent tone at the top, unintended consequences leading to thousands of employees being sacked, losing their jobs, and they probably be jailed for cheating customers. So it's amazing that a simple word, four-word sentence, 8 rhymes with great, can lead to thousands and thousands of customer employees creating the fraud. And all these are the employees that were involved in the not the fraud, but they were interviewed. They forced us to stay to hit sales targets, but there'll be no overtime allowances. Branch managers will make us stay out of work for an hour with no pay to cold call customers. It was an extremely dark period for me. I took medical leave due to the pressure. So can you imagine, you have to take sick leave due to the pressure. I was bullied and retaliated against for reporting sales integrity issues. So bullied, retaliated, sales integrity. It was the most degrading place to work in. I feel sick to my stomach most of the time, every time I drive by a Wells Fargo branch. And the funny thing is that the Wells Fargo CEO, John Stump, said that there was no incentive to do bad things. So of course there were no incentive to do bad things, because if they don't do the bad things, they will not get a commission. So it's really an oxymoronic phrase that was made by the CEO, and it's mind-boggling. So how indeed do you look at the tone at the top, 4 words, 8 rhymes with great, leading to a great impact on the employees of the organization, leading to massive losses in terms of fines for the billions of dollars of fines for the organization. So it is where I'll use the term snowball, that the tone at the top, when it snowballs down to the organization, it will snowball into unintended consequences for people in the organization, for stakeholders. So we looked at how to define the tone at the top. We call it having a situation where it leads to unintended consequences, and how do you manage moral dilemmas. And we looked at the trolley case study. We looked at the Wells Fargo case study. So we look also at the regulations. So we more or less have a understanding as to what is the tone at the top. It comprises of things like ethics, morals, values, culture, purpose. And these are the things that is wrapped up inside culture, inside tone at the top. So that's why it's very difficult to define tone at the top, because we look at all the regulations, it's about all these things mashed together, and we roughly call it tone at the top, which is very challenging, because then it's difficult to manage what is tone at the top. So that's why my view is that tone at the top is better managed by what are the unintended consequences that can possibly be faced by people or stakeholders, that can be possibly faced by stakeholders. And these unintended consequences will result in moral dilemmas that is faced, or ethical dilemmas faced by stakeholders, including employees. And when they are faced by this, what do they do? What do they do? So how do we get the tone right in organizations? So I mentioned this earlier, when I started the presentation, when I talked about the tone in the middle. So the tone in the middle from this article from Forbes magazine is a firm's culture. When thousands of employees, over 5,000 employees, engage and fairly openly in illicit behavior, it's not hard to conclude that management and the bank failed to curb a culture of contempt for customers, for the law, and ultimately for shareholders. So how can the tone at the top cascade down can result in a culture of contempt? And the reason why I showed this picture of a chain breaking is there's a saying that says the strength of the chain is as good as its weakest link. So the weakest link usually here is a corporate culture. And what causes a corporate culture to break down so that the whole chain is not strong? The culture breaks down because there's no shared values. So remember, values are both external and internal. You have ethical values and moral values. Ethical values is what is external to the organization, to the person, and internal values are your morals. So when there's a mismatch of ethics and morals, there's a breakdown in culture because it's not shared, and as a result, the tone from the middle goes berserk, and here you have a culture of contempt. So call it what it may, but when all this tone at the top that's wrongly snowballed down the middle, down to the organization, that's where the tone at the top will fail. So big recommendation is really, and for those of you who attended the last week's the the last webinar on purpose, I also showed this diagram that the essence of leadership, or the tone at the top, is being able to see the iceberg before it hits the Titanic. But what is this thing called the iceberg? So the iceberg is the unintended consequences, things that you don't see, that you need to open up your eyes really huge in order to see the unintended consequences and the moral dilemmas that will result as a result of unintended consequences. So how do we break down, not literally, but how do we break down this iceberg? How do we break down its components so that you can manage each of them, so that you can manage the tone at the top? So here, my recommendation is not managing the tone at the top. So tone at the top can't be fixed because it's very waffly, very vague, very nebulous, because tone at the top is always described with, along with words like values, culture, purpose, ethics, morals, and it's very difficult to wrap your head around tone at the top in itself. So my guidance to you is to manage the iceberg, manage what's below the surface. And what's below the surface? So things like purpose, values, culture, and stakeholders. So these are the things which are the iceberg itself. And once again, it starts with purpose. The tone at the top is, like I say, my experience is that it's vaguely defined. And in order to manage tone at the top much better, is really to understand what's underneath the tone at the top. And the first one is called purpose. What is your why? And we all learned from the past webinars that the why is linked to your stakeholders. So here, your stakeholders. So stakeholders are linked to your purpose, which is your why. So why do we do something? Because we want to deliver value to customers. So each of these whys would drive what you believe in, which is your values. If you believe in the values which are linked to your stakeholders, the values need to be linked to whether it's commensurate or linked to your own internal values, which are your morals. Is it linked to external, the code of conduct, the code of ethics? Is it external? So if these values are shared, meaning that if both the employees and the individual and the stakeholders and the company believe in all these values, which drive why you want to do the things for your stakeholders, then you have the right culture. And when these values are shared, they have the right action, the right behaviors, the right attitudes, then all these things come together to define what we call the tone at the top. Thanks, Vijay. Yeah, we took 7 webinars to come up with this slide here. So let me then break it down and wrap this up by how it's linked to the various case studies that we covered. The parable of the sadhu was about behavior, attitudes, action. So each of them individually, the Americans, the Kiwis, the Japanese, and the Swiss, each of them individually had their own values and they behaved in their own way. So Americans and the Swiss gave clothes, the Japanese gave food, the Kiwis or New Zealanders helped to carry the sadhu down a little bit. So everybody have their own behaviors, had their own actions, had their own attitudes, had their own values. So individual attitudes, individual actions, individual attitudes, and individual behaviors, and these were not shared. If they were shared, meaning that they were all the same, they will all agree to either let the sadhu die, it's okay. If they share that, it's fine. But if they have preferably the shared values and behaviors of bringing the sadhu down and not climb the mountain, That's also good, but they did not have shared values. They all did their own thing. So tone at the top is having the right mechanism to bring shared values together. And you work backwards, what are these values? And what's the purpose? So for the parable of the sadhu, what is your why? Is your purpose to reach top of the mountain, no matter what? Or is your purpose to climb the mountain, but not at the price of safety, personal safety, and also safety of other people? So it may not be the sadhu, could be a fellow climber. So when I climb, my purpose is very simple: to reach the summit safely with my fellow climbers. So if there's a situation where the weather goes bad or one of my fellow climbers gets injured, and even though I can keep on climbing to reach the top, but my fellow climber is injured, he cannot reach the top, I must go back to my purpose. My purpose is to climb to the top safely with all my fellow climbers. It's very clear. My purpose is that, and my values are driven by that purpose. And I share these values with all my fellow climbers, morally and ethically. As a result, once we have a shared culture, shared values, we have a common culture, meaning that when we climb, we understand very perfectly. So climbing culture is very simple. When we climb, we take care of each other. If one person cannot reach the top, nobody reaches the top. We make sure that we bring somebody safely down, even at the expense of me not reaching the top. So that's why the parable of the sadhu is such an important case study, because now you know how it's linked. So this diagram here is completely linked to the parable of the sadhu. It's linked to the Wells Fargo case study, and it will give you a template to guide you as to how to manage the tone at the top. So as you meet with unintended consequences, as you meet with ethical dilemmas, this diagram hopefully will help you figure out how to get out of that situation one way or the other. I got 2 more slides and I'll be ending. So today we'll be ending at a bit earlier, just before 8 o'clock. Just 2 more slides. So I covered this book that I just read. I think it's about 2 webinars ago, last month, I think, where the writer Malcolm Gladwell talked about this character called Eurodivi. Eurodivi is a person in Russian fairy tale, also known as a holy fool. So the holy fool is what we call a truth teller, somebody who will do nothing but just tell the truth. And the equivalent of what we have today is called a whistleblower. In most organizations, in most countries, a whistleblowing policy is mandatory. So whether it's through the Code of Corporate Governance or through the listing rules, it's required for all companies in many regimes. So it's not something unusual, but whistleblower is not good enough, because only when something goes wrong then you blow the whistle. But it is good to have a situation where you have truth tellers within the organization. So my last slide for this evening is really for you to have 2 takeaways. So using that diagram and to say that tone at the top results in moral dilemmas, and moral dilemmas are very real and they lead to unintended consequences, as can be seen in the Wells Fargo case study and in the parable of the sadhu case study. So don't manage tone at the top by itself. So manage moral dilemmas and manage unintended consequences. And how do you do this? By giving rise to a code of behavior. Tell people and teach them how to behave. Give them guidance. Give them training. Tell them what to do when they meet with it. So think of as many scenarios as possible to tell them what is right, what is wrong. Give them guidance. So it's not enough to just roll out a code of behavior, roll out ethics, and then when they first join a company, you ask them to read it, and then for the rest of their life, they don't read it. But do continuous training, continuous case studies, reinforce it, reward people who abide by the code of behavior, code of ethics, and punish people who don't follow it. But it is a lifelong, ongoing exercise to manage behavior, and culture is not something that you leave alone. So culture, code of behavior morals, values, ethics, dilemmas. They're all intertwined, purpose, as this diagram has shown. So your code of behavior must encapsulate everything in this diagram here. So whether you call it code of ethics, code of behavior, code of guidance, is something that is got to be kept alive and not just a white elephant, which I see in many organizations. So tone at the top is a very difficult thing to manage. So in conclusion, manage moral dilemmas, manage unintended consequences, and capture these moral dilemmas and unintended consequences into your code of conduct, code of ethics, and do lots of training and communication, enforcement, and encourage people to tell the truth when they are faced with uncomfortable situations. So don't have to be wrong situation or criminal situation where you blow the whistle. As long as they are uncomfortable, let them talk it out. Give people an avenue for blowing off their steam. Reward people rightly, punish people wrongly. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions. So that's my last slide for this evening. For webinar number 7. Next month, we have a webinar, the eighth and last webinar on sustainability framework. It's quite exciting one. We have the, not just on sustainability, but we're going to have climate change, task force for climate financial disclosure. We have speakers from UK, from Singapore, with a panel of 4 speakers, international speakers. So pretty exciting to cap it up. So we've covered culture, stakeholder, business model, risk management, long-term value creation, purpose, tone at the top today. We've just finished that, and last one will be on sustainability. I'll be happy to take questions for those who have still in the webinar today. All the webinars are available, and the first 6 are already available on YouTube. So if you Google your YouTube channel, Black Sun Communications, you can see the first 6 webinars. It's about an hour and a half each, depending on which one. And today's one should be up by next week. Any questions before you call it a night? Do mark down your calendar for the 13th of August, 6:30 on sustainability. A lot of people think that sustainability reporting is just a requirement, it's a green kind of thing, it's environment. It's more than that. It's sustainability of everything that you do. So the truth is that sustainability is linked to culture. How do you sustain your culture? How do you sustain your business model? How do you sustain your tone at the top? How do you sustain your value creation? So it's not just about environment or about CSR, about doing good things. It's more than that. It's an existential question. How do you sustain your company on an ongoing basis? It's existential. It's not just about ESG. Much more than that. It's a fundamental thing that's linked to trust. How can I trust the organization to be around tomorrow? Going once. Any more questions? Going twice. Right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending our session. Thank you. Shout out to the Working Capital once again for hosting us on this series of 8 webinars on behalf of Black Sun and the Working Capital. Thank you everybody for your time and patience this evening. Thank you. Good night, everybody.